There is a specific sound a hospital room makes in the seconds after someone says something that cannot be unsaid. Not silence exactly. The machines keep their steady rhythm. The fetal monitor keeps tracking its small mechanical heartbeat. Somewhere down the hallway a cartwheel squeaks against linoleum, the ordinary business of a maternity ward continuing exactly as it had been continuing all evening. But inside the room itself something goes very, very quiet. I was 38 weeks and 4 days pregnant, lying in a hospital bed with contractions arriving every 4 minutes, gripping the rail with one hand while my husband Mark sat in the chair beside me, the chair he had occupied for the past 2 hours, holding my other hand through each wave of pain. And then, between one contraction and the next, in the specific lull that exists when your body is gathering itself for the next wave, Mark let go of my hand. He sat back in the chair. And he said, "Sarah, I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you now because I can't keep carrying this through whatever happens tonight." I remember thinking, in that strange suspended half-second, that whatever he was about to say could not possibly be worse than what my body was currently doing. I remember thinking that nothing could compete with the contraction that had just ended. I was wrong. "I want a divorce," he said. "I've been seeing someone else. For over a year. I can't be here for this and keep pretending." The fetal monitor kept its steady rhythm. The cartwheel squeaked somewhere down the hallway. The ordinary business of the maternity ward continued exactly as it had been continuing all evening. And my husband stood up, picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, and walked toward the door. I called his name. I don't fully remember what I said, only the sound of my own voice, raw and disbelieving, asking him to wait, to explain, to do literally anything except what he was actually doing. He paused at the door. He turned around. "I'm sorry," he said. "I just can't." And he left. He did not come back that night. He did not come back the next morning, when our daughter was born at 6:14 a.m. with only a labor and delivery nurse named Patricia holding my hand through the final hour, because the friend I'd called in a panic from the hospital bathroom hadn't arrived yet, and because the man who was supposed to be there had already driven to another woman's apartment. My name is Sarah Whitman. This is the story of what happened in the 6 months after that night. And what Mark did not know when he eventually came back about exactly what those 6 months had built. Stay with me, because this story does not end the way you think it does in the first 10 minutes. Subscribe right now because this channel exists to tell exactly this kind of story. New story every single day. Hit that button and let's keep going. I want to tell you about Mark before October 7th because the man who stood up and walked out of that hospital room was not, for most of our marriage, the man I had married 8 years earlier. Mark Whitman and I met at a mutual friend's barbecue, the kind of unremarkable summer gathering that produces, occasionally and without warning, the person you end up spending the rest of your adult life with. He was funny in a quiet way, the kind of humor that arrives a beat after you expect it and lands harder because of the delay. He worked in commercial construction management for his father's company, a mid-sized firm called Whitman Construction that had been building office parks and retail centers across 3 counties for almost 30 years. I want to be careful and honest about the early years of our marriage, because I think it matters to understanding everything that happened later. Those years were genuinely good. Not performatively good, not the curated version people present at anniversary dinners, but actually structurally good in the way that comes from 2 people who generally like being around each other and generally handled conflict without it curdling into something corrosive. Mark's father, Harold Whitman, founded the company in the early 90s, building it from a small residential contracting business into a firm that, by the time Mark and I married, employed nearly 200 people across multiple ongoing projects. Harold was, by every account I encountered over 8 years of marriage to his son, exactly the kind of man people describe as old-fashioned in the better sense of that word. He believed in showing up. He believed in paying people fairly and on time. He believed, with a conviction that occasionally made him seem almost stubborn about it, that how you treated the people around you mattered considerably more than how impressive you appeared to outsiders. Harold liked me from the beginning in a way that felt, even in those early years, slightly more substantial than the polite acceptance new in-laws often extend to each other. He asked real questions and listened to the actual answers. He remembered details about my work, about my own family, about the specific small things I mentioned only once in passing months earlier. I came to understand over the years that this attentiveness was simply who Harold was, the same quality that had presumably made him effective at managing relationships across 200 employees and countless subcontractors over 3 decades. Mark, I should say honestly, did not inherit quite the same temperament from his father. He was kind generally and he was capable professionally. But there was a restlessness in him that I noticed early, a particular dissatisfaction that seemed to exist somewhat independent of his actual circumstances, the kind of dissatisfaction that finds new objects to attach itself to whenever the previous object stops providing enough friction to feel interesting. For the first several years of our marriage, that restlessness expressed itself in relatively harmless ways. A new hobby pursued intensely for several months before being abandoned. A persistent, low-grade sense that our life, comfortable as it was somehow missing some additional dimension that other people's lives apparently possessed. I did not, I want to be honest, see where this restlessness was eventually heading. I thought it was simply a personality trait, something to be patient with, something that did not require active concern. I was wrong about that, in ways that took me considerable time to fully understand. We had been trying to have a child for almost 3 years before I finally became pregnant, 3 years that involved their own particular kind of grief, the specific grief of wanting something your body will not yet provide, month after month, with the accumulating weight of disappointment that people who have not experienced infertility often underestimate. Mark was, throughout most of those 3 years, genuinely supportive in the ways that mattered. He came to every appointment that allowed partners. He researched treatment options alongside me. He held me through the specific devastation of negative test after negative test, the particular cruelty of a process that asks you to hope completely and then absorb disappointment completely over and over for years. I want to flag something here because I think it matters to the larger pattern. Somewhere around the second year of trying, I began noticing a subtle shift in Mark's engagement with the process. Not a dramatic withdrawal, nothing I could have pointed to definitively at the time, but a kind of distance that crept into his participation. He still came to appointments, but his attention during them felt slightly more divided. He still discussed treatment plans with me, but the conversations felt increasingly like he was performing engagement rather than actually present within it. I attributed this, at the time, to the simple exhaustion that prolonged infertility treatment produces in both partners. I did not yet understand that something else was beginning, quietly, alongside our fertility struggles. When I finally became pregnant in the spring of that third year, the joy was genuinely overwhelming for both of us, at least initially. Mark cried when I showed him the positive test, the kind of unguarded crying I had rarely seen from him before. For the first trimester, the restlessness I had noticed creeping in seemed to recede almost entirely, replaced by something that looked, from the outside, like genuine excitement about the pregnancy and the life it represented. The second trimester is when I first noticed him being late coming home from work with increasing frequency. The third trimester is when I first noticed him taking phone calls in other rooms, calls he described when I asked as work-related matters requiring privacy because of confidential client details. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable here. Some part of me, even then in the later months of pregnancy, sensed that something was not entirely right. I did not have evidence. I did not have anything I could have articulated clearly even to myself, let alone confronted Mark about directly. What I had was a kind of low, persistent unease that I worked very hard to suppress, because confronting it directly, during a pregnancy I had fought 3 years to achieve, felt like inviting a catastrophe I was not prepared to face. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that the particular vulnerability of late pregnancy, the physical discomfort and emotional volatility that comes with carrying a child in its final weeks, was distorting my perception of ordinary marital friction into something more sinister than it actually was. I was, in retrospect, not being paranoid at all. I was simply not yet willing to fully see what I was already, on some level, perceiving. I learned, eventually, considerably more about the affair than I knew on the night Mark walked out of that hospital room. I want to share what I learned because I think the specific texture of it matters to understanding what happened afterward. Her name was Jessica Reyes. She worked as a project coordinator for one of Whitman Construction's regular subcontractors, which meant Mark and Jessica had professional contact that predated, by nearly 2 years, the beginning of whatever developed between them. They had met at a site walkthrough, the kind of ordinary professional encounter that happens hundreds of times across a construction career without producing anything beyond a working relationship. I do not know with complete certainty exactly when their professional relationship became something else. Based on what Mark eventually told me in fragments, across several difficult conversations in the months following our separation, The affair began approximately 14 months before our daughter's birth, which placed its origin point somewhere in the early months of my final, successful pregnancy attempt. I want to be careful here about how I characterize Jessica, because I think the easiest narrative move, the one that satisfies a certain kind of emotional appetite, is to villainize her completely, to make her the singular architect of betrayal rather than a participant in a betrayal that fundamentally belonged to Mark, the person who had made vows to me, not to her. What I can tell you about Jessica, based on what I eventually learned, is that she was 29 years old, recently divorced herself, and had been, by Mark's own later account, genuinely unaware for a significant portion of their relationship's early months that Mark's wife was actively trying to conceive a child, information he had apparently been careful to withhold or minimize when discussing his marriage with her. This detail matters to me, honestly, not because it absolves Jessica of responsibility for participating in a relationship with a married man, but because it complicates the satisfying simplicity of a narrative where one woman is purely villainous and another purely victimized. Jessica eventually learned the full circumstances, including the pregnancy, and continued the relationship anyway, which I do hold her accountable for. But the architecture of the deception, the careful management of what each woman in his life knew and did not know, belonged entirely to Mark. He had been, in essence, running two separate realities simultaneously for over a year, carefully maintaining the boundaries between them, until the specific pressure of my labor and impending delivery apparently made maintaining those boundaries feel, to him, impossible to sustain any longer. I want to note something about the timing of his confession, because I have thought about it extensively in the months since. Mark did not choose to tell me about the affair during my pregnancy, when the news, however devastating, might have allowed me to make different decisions about the remainder of my pregnancy, about who would be present for the birth, about how to structure the practical realities of bringing a child into a marriage that was already, unbeknownst to me, ending. He chose instead to tell me in the final hour before our daughter's birth, a timing that I have come to understand, through subsequent reflection and considerable therapy, as something other than simple cowardice, though cowardice was certainly present. I believe, based on everything I learned afterward about the pressure Mark had been under, that Jessica had given him an ultimatum sometime in the preceding weeks, demanding he resolve his marriage before the birth or lose her entirely, and that Mark, faced with that ultimatum colliding directly with the imminent arrival of his daughter, chose the path of least immediate resistance, which was to simply tell me and leave, rather than navigate the considerably harder work of ending things with Jessica or genuinely confronting what he wanted his life to look like. This does not excuse what he did. I want to be unambiguous about that. But understanding the mechanics of how he arrived at that specific, devastating timing helped me eventually process what happened as something other than purely random cruelty, which made it, paradoxically, somewhat easier to move forward from. I need to walk you through the remainder of that night because I think the specific details matter, and because I have never told this part of the story in full to anyone outside my closest circle. After Mark left, I sat alone in that hospital room for approximately 11 minutes, according to the nurse's notes I later requested, before I was able to compose myself enough to press the call button. Patricia, the labor and delivery nurse who had been checking on me periodically throughout the evening, came in to find me crying, alone, mid-contraction, with no explanation immediately available for what had happened. I want to tell you about Patricia because she matters considerably to this story, even though she appears only briefly within it. Patricia was, I would guess, in her late 50s, a woman who had clearly spent decades doing exactly this work, the specific work of being present for people during the most vulnerable hours of their lives. When I finally managed to explain, in fragments between contractions, what had just happened, Patricia did not offer empty reassurances or rush to fill the silence with platitudes about how everything would be okay. She simply said, "Okay, then it's you and me tonight. Let's get your girl here safely, and we'll figure out everything else afterward." I called my best friend Lauren from the hospital room phone, my own cell phone having been left, in the chaos, somewhere I could not immediately locate. Lauren lived 40 minutes away and arrived as quickly as humanly possible, but the specific mathematics of labor do not always accommodate the travel time of the people we most need present. My daughter, whom I named Eleanor after my own grandmother, was born at 6:14 the following morning. Patricia was on one side of the bed. Lauren, who had arrived with 20 minutes to spare, was on the other. Mark was not present for any part of it. I held my daughter for the first time at 6:18 a.m., exhausted beyond anything I had previously experienced, processing simultaneously the most significant joy of my life and the most devastating betrayal, two realities that should not, by any reasonable logic, be able to occupy the same morning, occupying it anyway because life does not organize itself according to what would be reasonable. I called Harold, Mark's father, around 8 that morning, after Lauren had gently suggested that someone in Mark's family should know what had happened, and that I should not be the one carrying the full weight of making that call alone given everything I had just been through. Harold arrived at the hospital within the hour. I want to spend considerable time on Harold because what happened with him over the following 6 months is, in many ways, the actual heart of this story. Harold Whitman arrived at the hospital that morning looking, I remember clearly, like a man who had aged considerably in the time it took him to drive from his house to the maternity ward. He came directly to my room, and when he saw me holding his granddaughter, his face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He did not ask me to explain what had happened. He already knew, I would learn later, because Mark had called him sometime that morning, presumably to manage how the information reached his father, though Harold's account of that call suggested Mark's explanation had been considerably more self-serving than the reality I had lived through. Harold sat down in the chair beside my bed, the same chair Mark had occupied the night before, and he looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "Can I hold her?" he asked. I handed her to him. He held her with the particular careful confidence of someone who had held infants before, who understood the specific physics of supporting a newborn's head and neck. "She's beautiful, Sarah," he said, and his voice carried something thick in it. "I'm so sorry. I am so deeply, profoundly sorry for what my son did to you." "You don't need to apologize for him," I said. "I know I don't need to," Harold said. "But I'm going to anyway because someone in this family needs to. And he clearly isn't capable of doing it adequately himself." We talked for a long time that morning, Harold holding Eleanor through most of it, while I processed slowly and in fragments the reality of what had happened. Harold asked careful, gentle questions about what I needed practically in the immediate term. He asked whether I had told my own parents yet. He asked whether I had a place to go after discharge, since the home I had shared with Mark suddenly represented a complicated and painful question, rather than a simple answer. "I want you to know something," Harold said, near the end of that conversation, before he had to leave for a meeting he clearly did not want to attend but could not entirely avoid. "Whatever happens between you and Mark, whatever the legal realities end up looking like, you and this little girl are my family. That does not change based on what my son decided to do last night. I need you to understand that clearly, because I suspect the coming months are going to involve a lot of uncertainty, and I want at least this one thing to be completely certain for you." I did not fully understand in that moment how seriously Harold meant this statement, or how thoroughly he would act on it over the following months. I understood it more as the kind of comforting thing a decent person says during a crisis, well-intentioned but not necessarily a commitment to specific, concrete action. I was wrong about that. Harold meant it with a precision and follow-through that would eventually reshape the entire structure of his company's succession plan. I want to be honest about the first weeks after Eleanor's birth, because I think the easy version of this story skips quickly past the actual difficulty of those weeks toward the more satisfying narrative of eventual justice and resolution. The first weeks were genuinely brutal. I was recovering physically from childbirth while simultaneously processing the end of an 8-year marriage, all while learning in real time how to care for a newborn who required round-the-clock attention regardless of my own emotional or physical state. Mark did not disappear entirely during this period, though his presence was sporadic and, I came to understand, largely motivated by his own guilt rather than any consistent commitment to co-parenting. He came by twice in the first 2 weeks, both visits brief and uncomfortable, both ending with him leaving before any substantive conversation about practical arrangements could occur. I learned during the 3rd week that he had moved in with Jessica almost immediately after leaving the hospital, a detail I gathered not from Mark himself but from a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it, apparently unaware that I had not yet learned this particular piece of information. My own parents, who lived 2 states away, offered to come stay with me, an offer I gratefully accepted for the first month, their presence providing a kind of practical and emotional scaffolding that made the difference between barely surviving those weeks and genuinely drowning in them. Lauren, my best friend, organized a meal delivery rotation among our mutual friends without my asking her to, the kind of practical support that matters enormously during crisis even when it feels in the moment like a small gesture relative to the magnitude of what you're processing. I want to acknowledge honestly that I spent considerable time during those first weeks in states of genuine despair, the kind that makes ordinary functioning feel like an impossible achievement. I am not telling you this story as a narrative of uninterrupted strength and composure. There were days I could not stop crying. There were nights I lay awake replaying the exact moment Mark let go of my hand, the specific sound of his voice saying the words that ended our marriage, on a loop that felt impossible to interrupt. What I want you to understand, if you are listening to this and recognizing something in your own circumstances, is that the strength that eventually emerged from this period did not arrive instantly or completely. It accumulated slowly through small daily choices, through the practical necessity of caring for a newborn who needed me functional regardless of how I felt, through the gradual rebuilding of a sense of self that Mark's betrayal had genuinely shattered. I learned about what Harold had been doing, during those first weeks and months, only gradually, through a series of conversations that unfolded over time rather than a single dramatic revelation. Harold had founded Whitman Construction in the early 90s as a sole proprietorship, eventually incorporating the business as it grew, with himself as majority shareholder and, for the past decade, Mark holding a meaningful minority stake that had been structured, years earlier, as part of a gradual succession plan transitioning the company toward Mark's eventual leadership. This succession plan had been, prior to Eleanor's birth and Mark's departure, relatively straightforward. Harold intended to retire within the following 5 to 7 years, transferring majority control to Mark at that point, the kind of generational business transition that Whitman Construction's particular industry and culture made fairly conventional. What Harold did in the weeks following my call to him from the hospital was begin, quietly and through his own attorney rather than the company's regular legal counsel, restructuring this succession plan entirely. I want to be precise about what this restructuring actually involved, because I think the specifics matter considerably to understanding the eventual reveal that this story builds toward. Harold established a trust, naming Eleanor as the primary beneficiary, into which he began transferring a portion of his own shares in the company, separate entirely from Mark's existing minority stake. This was not, I want to be clear, an attempt to strip Mark of what he already legally held. Mark's existing shares remained his. What changed was the trajectory of future succession, the additional shares and eventual controlling interest that Harold had originally intended to transfer to Mark upon his own retirement. Those shares instead were being directed toward a trust for Eleanor's benefit, structured with provisions that would eventually give her, upon reaching adulthood, a controlling position in the company that her father had once been positioned to inherit in full. Harold explained his reasoning to me directly, during a conversation that took place approximately 2 months after Eleanor's birth, when he visited specifically to discuss what he had been arranging. I built this company believing in certain things, he told me, sitting in my living room while Eleanor slept in the bassinet nearby. I believed in showing up. I believed in being present for the people who depend on you. I watched my son fail, completely and catastrophically, at the single most important moment of presence that life had asked of him so far. I cannot, in good conscience, hand him a controlling stake in something I built around those values, knowing what I now know about how he handles the moments that actually matter. What about Mark's existing shares? I asked. What happens to those? Those remain his, Harold said. I'm not interested in punishing him through the company's legal structure in ways that wouldn't hold up, or that I'd consider inappropriate regardless of how I feel personally. What I'm doing is simply redirecting what was always within my own discretion to give. I was always planning to gift additional shares and eventual control to whichever of my descendants I believed would carry this company forward responsibly. That assessment has changed. Does Mark know about this? I asked. Not yet, Harold said. And I want to be honest with you about my reasoning for that timing. I'm not hiding this to spring some dramatic surprise on him for the satisfaction of it. I'm simply not ready to have that conversation yet, because I'm still processing my own anger at what he did, and I want to approach that conversation eventually from a place of clarity rather than raw fury. I want to give you a sense of the texture of those 6 months, because I think the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding matters considerably to understanding the eventual resolution of this story. I returned to work, part-time initially, around the 10-week mark, my employer having been genuinely accommodating given the circumstances. I am a marketing coordinator for a regional healthcare system, work that had felt, before all of this happened, pleasant but not especially central to my sense of self. During those months it became something more than that, a structure that helped organize my days during a period when organizing anything felt enormously difficult. I started therapy during the second month, a decision that proved, in retrospect, to be one of the most important choices I made during this entire period. My therapist, a careful and patient woman named Dr. Ramirez, helped me work through not just the immediate grief of Mark's betrayal but the longer arc of questions it raised about my own judgment, my own capacity to have missed or minimized warning signs that, in retrospect, seemed clearer than they had felt at the time. "You're not responsible for his choices," she told me, during one particularly difficult session around the fourth month. "The fact that you can see warning signs in retrospect doesn't mean you failed to act on information you didn't yet have. Hindsight constructs clarity that didn't exist in the actual moment." Mark's involvement with Eleanor during these months remained inconsistent. He would visit for a few weeks with reasonable regularity, then disappear for stretches of 2 or 3 weeks with minimal explanation, a pattern that I eventually came to understand reflected the particular instability of his relationship with Jessica, whose own feelings about Mark's ongoing connection to his daughter and ex-wife fluctuated considerably. We finalized our divorce during the 5th month, a process that, given the relative simplicity of our financial situation and the absence of significant shared assets beyond our former home, proceeded without the extended legal conflict that complicates many divorces. Mark agreed to standard child support arrangements. I retained primary physical custody, with Mark having scheduled visitation that he exercised inconsistently throughout this period. I want to note something about my own emotional state during these months, because I think it complicates any simple narrative of pure villainy and victimization. I did not, during most of this period, feel primarily angry at Mark, though anger certainly arrived in waves. What I felt more consistently was a kind of profound disorientation, the specific vertigo of discovering that a person you had built 8 years of life around was someone other than who you believed them to be. Harold remained a consistent, steady presence throughout these months in ways that meaningfully shaped how I experienced this period. He visited regularly, always calling ahead, always respecting whatever boundaries I needed in the moment. He insisted on contributing financially to Eleanor's care in ways that went considerably beyond what Mark's child support obligations required, establishing a separate education fund for her that he funded directly, independent of anything related to the company shares he was simultaneously restructuring. "This isn't about Mark," he told me once, when I tried to gently push back on the scale of his generosity. "This is about my granddaughter and about you. Mark's failures don't get to determine the limits of what I'm willing to do for either of you." 6 months after Eleanor's birth, almost to the day, Mark called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying a tone I had not heard from him since before the affair began, something that sounded, genuinely, like the version of him I had known during our better years. "Things ended with Jessica," he told me, without my having asked. "About 3 weeks ago. I've been doing some thinking since then and I'd like to talk, if you're willing, about Eleanor. About maybe being more present than I've been." I sat with this for a long moment before responding. I had spent considerable time in therapy processing exactly this scenario, the eventual possibility that Mark might attempt to reinsert himself into our lives once his relationship with Jessica ran its course, and I had worked deliberately on developing a clear sense of what I would and would not accept if that moment arrived. "I'm willing to talk," I said, "but I need you to understand something clearly before we do. Whatever happens with your relationship to Eleanor going forward needs to be built on actual consistency, not on convenience based on what else is happening in your life. She deserves a father who shows up because he wants to show up, not because his other options have temporarily narrowed." "I understand that," Mark said, and I want to be fair in saying that his voice carried what sounded like genuine humility, a quality I had not heard from him in a long time. We agreed to meet the following weekend at my house, so he could spend time with Eleanor in a setting that was comfortable and familiar for her. Mark arrived that Saturday afternoon looking, I noted, considerably more subdued than the version of himself I remembered from before the affair, before the restlessness had calcified into something that destroyed our marriage entirely. I had, in preparation for his visit, been organizing some paperwork at my kitchen table, including a folder Harold had dropped off the previous week containing updated documentation about Eleanor's education trust, Materials I had been reviewing with my own attorney to understand the practical implications for Eleanor's eventual financial future. The folder remained on the kitchen table when Mark arrived, not deliberately left there as some kind of staged reveal, simply present because I had not yet finished reviewing the documents and had not anticipated needing to hide them before his visit. Mark noticed the folder almost immediately, his attention drawn by the letterhead of the law firm Harold used for his personal and estate matters, a firm whose name Mark would have recognized from years of his own father's business dealings. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the folder before I could explain its contents myself. I watched his face as he read through the documents, watched the specific progression of his expression as he worked through what he was actually looking at. Confusion first, the simple confusion of someone encountering unexpected paperwork. Then a slower, more complicated recognition, as he began understanding the actual structure of what his father had arranged. "This is about the company," he said slowly. "This is Dad's restructuring of the succession plan." "Yes," I said. "He's putting shares into a trust for Eleanor," Mark said, still reading, his voice carrying a quality I had not anticipated, something more like dawning comprehension than immediate anger. "Beyond what I already hold. The shares he was planning to transfer to me eventually. He's redirecting those to her trust instead." "Yes," I said again. Mark set the folder down slowly. He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched him process not just the practical implications of what he had just learned, but something that looked genuinely like the beginning of a more complete understanding of how thoroughly his choices had reshaped the trajectory of his own life, not through any punitive action his father had taken against him directly, but through the simple, devastating logic of consequences accumulating from decisions he had made. "Does he know I'm here today?" Mark asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I didn't tell him you were coming, but I also haven't hidden it from him. You'd need to ask him that yourself." "I should call him," Mark said. "You should," I agreed. "But maybe not right this second. Eleanor's waiting to see her father. That can happen first." Mark called his father later that same evening, after spending several hours with Eleanor, hours that I observed from a careful distance, with something like cautious optimism about the possibility of genuine, sustained presence going forward. I was not present for the full conversation between Mark and Harold, which took place over the phone after Mark had left my house. What I know about it comes from what Harold shared with me afterward, during a conversation that occurred several days later. "He asked me why I did it," Harold told me. "Why I restructured everything the way I did. Why I redirected shares to Eleanor's trust instead of maintaining the original plan for his eventual full control." "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I told him the truth," Harold said. "I told him that I built this company around the belief that showing up for the people who depend on you is the single most important thing a person can do, and that I watched him fail completely at the most important moment of presence his life had asked of him so far. I told him that I couldn't, in good conscience, hand him the keys to something I'd built around those values without seeing meaningful, sustained evidence that he understood what he'd actually done and was prepared to be different going forward." "How did he respond to that?" I asked. Harold was quiet for a moment before answering. "He cried, Sarah. I haven't heard my son cry like that since he was a boy. He told me he understood. He told me he wanted to earn back whatever trust was possible to earn back, not for the company but for Eleanor, for the chance to actually be her father in a way that meant something." "Do you believe him?" I asked. "I believe he meant it in that moment," Harold said carefully. "Whether that translates into sustained change over years, I genuinely don't know yet. Neither does he, I suspect. That's something only time and consistent action will actually prove. I want to tell you where things stand currently, because I think an honest accounting matters more than a falsely tidy resolution. Mark has, over the months since that conversation with his father, maintained considerably more consistent involvement in Eleanor's life than he managed during the first 6 months after her birth. He visits regularly, on a schedule he has largely honored, and the visits themselves carry a quality of genuine presence that felt absent during the earlier sporadic period. I do not know with complete certainty whether this consistency reflects genuine, durable change or simply the current absence of the particular pressures that drove his earlier behavior. I have made peace with not needing to know this with certainty right now, focusing instead on observing the actual pattern of his behavior over time, the only reliable evidence available for assessing whether someone has genuinely changed. The trust Harold established for Eleanor remains in place, continuing to accumulate shares according to the restructured succession plan. Mark's own existing minority stake in the company remains his, unchanged from before any of this happened. The practical effect of Harold's restructuring is that Eleanor will, upon reaching adulthood, hold a considerably more significant position in her grandfather's company than her father currently holds, a fact that exists now as simply part of the family's financial architecture rather than as an active point of conflict between Mark and me. My relationship with Harold has deepened considerably through this entire experience, evolving into something that exists independent of my marriage to Mark having ended. He remains a consistent presence in Eleanor's life and in mine, the kind of grandfather whose steady, reliable love has provided a crucial counterbalance to the instability of her father's earlier behavior. I have, in the time since Eleanor's birth, rebuilt a sense of myself that exists independent of my marriage and its ending. I returned to work full-time around the one-year mark, took on additional responsibilities that have meaningfully advanced my career, and developed, slowly and through considerable deliberate effort, a sense of confidence that Mark's betrayal had genuinely shattered during those first devastating weeks. I have been talking for a long time, and I want to land somewhere honest before I let you go. This story is about a hospital room, and a husband who chose the worst possible moment to end a marriage, and a father-in-law whose response to his son's failure reshaped an entire company's future. But I think it is really about something else, something I have thought about extensively in the time since that night. The people who fail us, sometimes catastrophically, are not always the only people who get to define what happens next. Mark's choice to leave that hospital room was entirely his. But the response that followed, Harold's steady, consistent presence, Patricia's calm competence during the actual delivery, Lauren's immediate mobilization of practical support, my own gradual rebuilding through therapy and time, none of that belonged to Mark's narrative. It belonged to mine and to the people who chose, deliberately and repeatedly, to show up for me when he had chosen not to. I do not think the lesson here is that betrayal eventually receives some cosmic correction, that the universe rebalances itself in satisfying ways if you simply wait long enough. Sometimes betrayal simply remains betrayal, unredeemed by any subsequent justice. What I do think is true based on everything I lived through during those 6 months, is that the people who actually show up consistently and without requiring credit for it, end up mattering considerably more to the eventual shape of your life than the person whose absence created the crisis in the first place. If you are someone who has experienced the specific devastation of being abandoned during a moment when you most needed someone present, I want you to know something. The people who show up afterward, even if they cannot undo what happened, even if their presence arrives later than you needed it to, matter enormously. Let them. Let the Harolds and the Patricias and the Laurens of your own life do the work of rebuilding what someone else's failure tore down. Okay, we have been here a while, and I am genuinely grateful you stayed for all of it. My name is Sarah Whitman. Eleanor is walking now, the specific unsteady determination of a toddler discovering her own balance, and she has, I notice often, her grandfather's particular quality of careful attentiveness, the way she studies new objects before deciding how to engage with them. I think about that hospital room sometimes, the specific sound of the fetal monitor continuing its steady rhythm, while my entire understanding of my marriage collapsed in real time. I think about Patricia's calm voice telling me it was her and me that night, and how completely she meant it. I think the lesson I keep returning to is this. The night someone chooses to leave is not actually the end of the story, however much it might feel that way in the moment. It is simply the moment when you discover who else is willing to stay. If this story reached you, drop a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. If you have your own version of a Harold or a Patricia or a Lauren, someone who showed up when you needed it most, I want to hear about them. I read everything. Subscribe if you are new here. New story every single day. Take care of yourselves. And remember who actually stayed. I will see you in the next one.